Today, after the by-elections, the three main party leaders say they've got something to celebrate. But has anything really changed? This is Politics Live. With me today, Pensions Minister Laura Trott, Shadow Attorney General Emily Thornberry, Liberal Democrat Deputy Leader Daisy Cooper, the Deputy Editor of Conservative Home Henry Hill, and Mirror columnist Susie Boniface. A bruising night for the Conservatives, but it could have been worse. The Tories hold on to Boris Johnson's old seat of Uxbridge.
Westminster's been acting like the next election's a done deal. The Labour Party's been acting like it's a done deal. The people of Uxbridge just told all of them that it's not.
This 25-year-old is the new Labour MP for Selby and Ainsty. His mother thinks he'll go far.
He's going to do very well. I'm confident.
Future Prime Minister?
Why not? Why not? Never say never.
Today is a day of firsts. I'm the first leader to say Labour, Selby and Ainsty, ever.
But could Labour have done better?
The Uxbridge result shows that when you don't listen to the voters, you don't win elections, and I think that's something for us to reflect on.
And there's a big Lib Dem win in Somerton and Frome. Election guru Professor Sir John Curtice will be telling us what it all means. Well, let's take a look at some of the headlines overnight, starting with The Times. Sunak insists general election not a done deal after 2 defeats. Many pundits had predicted the Tories would lose all 3. The Independents say this: Sunak warned Tories are set to lose a hell of a lot of seats after by-election results. And this, finally, in The Sun, standing firm. Rishi hails victory as Boris's old seat is held, but Tories suffer 2 losses. Well, those are some of the headlines in the papers. Let's ask our guests how they would have written the headline after the by-election results. Starting with you, Laura, what would have been your thought in any headline?
Well, look, it was a mixed set of results. For us, obviously a great result for Steve in Uxbridge, and commiserations to Faye and Claire in Somerton and also in Selby. But I think, we've got a job to do. We know that after the last couple of years to regain trust of the electorate. That's what we're doing. Got the Prime Minister's 5 priorities. We're working on those. But what I think is also clear from these set of results is there's no overwhelming love for Starmer. This is not, it's not a done deal, as the Prime Minister said, the next election. So I think, we've all got a lot of work to do, but we think, we can make the case to the electorate and regain that trust.
Well, that was a long headline, Laura. Emily, your headline thought after the by-elections?
Well done, Keir. Commiserations, Danny. More work to do.
That's Danny in Uxbridge and South Ruislip. And for you, Daisy?
Another stonking win. The Lib Dems are back in the West Country.
Oh, well, that's more like a headline, I suppose. What about for you, Henry?
There's no ULEZ outside London.
Ultra-low emission zone,
Tories
very catchy.
Toast.
Tories are toast?
Tories are toast, but Labour is resting on its laurels.
What do you say to Tories are toast? Despite the fact that you held on in Uxbridge and South Ruislip, what do you say to Susie?
Well, I mean, we can see, where Labour are in charge, the electorate have rejected them, right? We've seen a foreshadowing of what Labour would be like in government with ULEZ, putting an unfair tax on the people who can least afford it, and people have rejected that. So I think where you have a choice to make about where Labour have been in charge, people have said, no, they don't want that. They want the Conservatives to represent them. And we now need to work hard on delivering things for the people in Britain, like cutting inflation, like growing the economy, like cutting the debt, cutting the waiting list and stopping the votes.
Well, before I get Emily's response, Henry, is that how you would see it? Is it really all about the ultra-low emission zone? There was no love for Rishi Sunak, was there, on the doorstep, according to his own candidate, or now MP?
No, we didn't hear much from what we were hearing from the campaign, that there was much enthusiasm for the government. There was a very narrow margin of victory and a strong local issue. It might be of great comfort to the Welsh Conservatives, where they also get to run against an incumbent Labour government, and they might be able to find some dividing lines. But if you're a Conservative MP or activist in other parts of the country, there's not all that much you can take from Uxbridge and South Ruislip, I think, unless there happens to be something similar against Andy Burnham or something. But without that, no.
All right, we're going to start with the results. Just before we go through them, Emily, that thought on Uxbridge and South Ruislip, it was the first result to come in last night. It was very close. But what's the lesson to be learnt?
I think the lesson is to think about ULEZ and think about the way in which it's being introduced. I mean, listen, as you know, somebody who was diagnosed on Monday with asthma, I feel quite strongly about ULEZ too. I feel quite strongly about air quality. I know that it has a really high. I mean, people who have strokes, it's a very high proportion of them who suffer from bad air quality. Children's lungs are very small. We do need to do something about it. But the truth is that given that we have this cost of living crisis, the way in which the ULEZ is being introduced at the moment to people in outer London,
by a London Labour mayor,
where there's not as good transport, and where there is no scrappage scheme. I mean, this is the other thing. The Conservatives have given 30 million, 40 million, to Tory mayors in other cities to help them with a scrappage scheme when they've been introducing ULEZ. We don't have one in London.
Well, we're going to come back.
So people can't change their cars and get compensation in the same way.
Have been subsidised to the tune of billions of pounds in London, but it's and I think.
Sorry, I'm talking about the scrappage scheme.
No, but
and the scrappage scheme is particularly important because if we want to change people to get rid of their old cars and get new ones, they need help.
All right,
well, the Conservatives have been saying this for months and months, and nobody has listened. And I'm glad that it took, the re-election of a Conservative MP in Uxbridge to finally get the Labour Party to listen to that.
May I just say one other thing? Which is, given that the Conservatives ran this by-election as vote for us and we will stop ULEZ, it's very difficult for them to then extrapolate that to, a result in some way that applies across the country, because it is only about ULEZ. And we are saying that we will, that we're asking Sadiq to think again about the way that ULEZ is being rolled out.
It's not just, but it's really important. It's not just about ULEZ, though. It's about what happens when you have a Labour government, that they impose a tax on people that can least afford it.
But Sadiq Khan's legal responsibility to reduce air quality was imposed by your government.
Conservative government.
And air traffic, unfortunately, air pollution is 50% of that is from traffic. If he wasn't going to cut traffic in order to produce air pollution, he would have to cut things like construction and industry.
I'm going to stop it there, Laura, because we're going to come back to this and return to it, because it's obviously a big issue in of itself, and we can analyse what we can take from that result in Uxbridge and South Ruislip in terms of general policy for both the main parties. Let's just show you, first of all, Uxbridge and South Ruislip. The Conservatives held it against some of the predictions. Steve Tuckwell there, who very much said it was about the ultra-low emission zone, a majority of just under 500. It was tight, and there was a recount, actually, quite early on. Let's have a look at the next by-election result that came in, which was Somerton and Frome in Somerset. Well, the Liberal Democrats called that within minutes of us actually going on air, and not long after the polls had closed. And Sarah Dyke, indeed, the favourite, the Liberal Democrat, won it, stonking majority there of just over 11,000 over the Conservative Faye Purbrick. If we go on to the final result from last night, Selby and Ainsty in North Yorkshire. A historic win for Labour in Keir Mather, nearly 16,500, a majority of just over 4,000 over the Conservative there. Let's talk to Sir John Curtis. We talk about swings, John, two historic swings, both in Somerton and Frome and in Selby and Ainsty. So a movement of support away from the governing party, the Conservative Party, to both the opposition parties. Take us through the context for those two seats and also Uxbridge and South Ruislip.
Well, Selby and Ainsty is certainly the most dramatic of the results, at least as judged by historical precedent. I reckon it's the second biggest swing from Conservative to Labour in by-election history. The only previous occasion when Labour did better than that was in Dudley in the 1992 to 97 Parliament. Indeed, there were a couple of other by-elections in that Parliament when Labour were putting on performances not far short of that achieved in Selby. Now, of course, that's not a very happy precedent for the Conservatives, because basically Labour are now putting in the kind of by-election performances, at least in Selby, that was followed by Conservative electoral defeat. Somerton and Frome, well, we're getting rather used to the Liberal Democrats putting in remarkably good performances in by-elections in seats where they're starting off as clearly the principal challenger to the Conservatives. This was actually only the 5th biggest swing in by-election history from Conservative Liberal Democrat, but 2 of the ones that were better than that and are in the top 4 are North Shropshire and Tiverton and Honiton, i.e. 2 of the other by-elections in this Parliament. From it, the Liberal Democrats can draw some hope that what evidently is their strategy for the general election is to focus on those constituencies where they are a reasonable close second to the Conservatives. They profit from the Conservatives, what they hope will be continuing electoral difficulties, and that will enable them to pick up a number of Conservative seats and thereby increase their parliamentary representation.
Yes.
What doesn't seem to be an ambition for the Democrats, however, is to turn these by-election victories into broader support for the party and getting it back to the kinds of levels of national support that it enjoyed up to 2010. Now, Uxbridge. Now, the interesting thing about Uxbridge, of course, is that you've already been talking about Ulez, is that the Conservative victor himself, Mr. Tuckwell, did not suggest that this was in any way evidence that voters, at least in West London, were beginning to warm to this Conservative administration, but he said it was all to do with Ulez. Now, if that's right, and that therefore what happened in Uxbridge is the exception rather than the rule, then we've got to be careful about extrapolating how far this can go. Now, sure, some people are saying, well, this shows at least when perhaps the Conservatives have a local Labour administration to campaign against, they might be able to exploit that. But I think we should remember, in much the same way as the Liberal Democrats can focus their resources in by-elections and do much better in by-elections than they can do in a general election when their resources are bound to be thinner. Equally, it's more difficult for parties to get voters to focus exclusively on local issues when there's a big national campaign going on, as in a general election. So to that extent, at least, we should be careful about drawing too much from what might be the exceptionalism of Somerton and Uxbridge, as opposed to the general trend that they broadly signify.
What about the message to Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer?
Well, I think the message to Rishi Sunak is that he had a big task in front of him 24 hours ago, and he's still got a big task in front of him. Essentially, the pathway to any prospect of Conservative recovery lies above all in 1, turning around the economy to get living standards to be improving, and 2, to get public services back on their feet, above all the health service. In my view, it's not trying to stop the boats. There isn't any clear evidence that that's an issue which is driving voters away from the Conservative Party. There is plenty of evidence that discontent with the economy, the cost of living crisis, the state of public services are issues that are leading some of those people who voted for the Conservatives in 2019 no longer to support the party. The other challenge, by the way, I think is ethics. The party has lost ground in the immediate wake of its failure to fall in behind the Privileges Committee report and to take the opportunity to distance itself from Boris Johnson. And, you know, voters, one of the reasons why voters don't necessarily trust the Conservative Party is because it was led by somebody who now has been found to have misled the House of Commons. That doesn't inspire confidence more broadly in a political party either.
So, John Curtice, thank you very much for the moment. Laura, let's start with you. These are historic defeats in Selby and Ainsty and Somerton and Frome. So John Curtice has already written this morning that the Conservatives, your party, are in deep electoral trouble. Would you agree with that?
We've got a lot of work to do. You know, I am not arguing with you at all that last year was dreadful, right? We were not good enough, and we have to really focus on rebuilding the trust of the electorate, right? And that is what all of us in government are doing every single day. That's what and John Curtice is completely right. The thing that are troubling people at the moment is the cost of living and its inflation. We've got to get that down. We saw some encouraging news this week that we've got the lowest level of inflation since March last year. It's still way too high. It's still way too high. I know that, and I understand the pressure that people are under, but we need to be working every day to get it down. and to grow the economy and to make things better for people. And I think, you know, we all know the job that we've got to do and we need to get on with it.
What message do you think is being sent to the Conservatives? Should Rishi Sunak change anything? He's still got those 5 pledges. Should he change anything as a result of what happened?
Well, I mean, there's no point going into a general election with 5 pledges if you've missed all 5. So he should perhaps review them and pick 2 that he might be able to focus on.
Which 2 would you go for?
I don't get the money to look at the internal polling for the party, but basically find the 2 which are the most salient, which probably does not include small boats, and then which ones you can realistically, in your innermost heart, actually have the most control over delivering, because a lot of his pledges are related to international trends and everything else, and there's no point setting a very specific, granular target if you can't control whether or not you hit it because of external market shocks. That just doesn't work.
Right. I mean, Emily, do you accept that Sadiq Khan lost you that seat in Uxbridge?
No, I don't think that. I wouldn't go as far as that. I don't think that's fair. I do think that there are a mixture of issues, and I do think it's the way in which ULEZ is being rolled out is a problem, and we need to look at that again, as I said earlier. And I think part of that has to be that Sadiq Khan really ought to be able to work with the government, and the government really ought to be able to work with him. And so, you know, they ought to be able to come to an agreement when it comes to scrappage schemes.
Yeah.
People need to be able to help and do the right thing.
But what does it say about a policy that is sincerely held, I'm sure, by Sadiq Khan? And you've talked about the air quality, but when the reality of politics in a cost of living crisis hits, that policy just didn't win it for you, did it?
I understand that, but we are between a rock and a hard place. I mean, the air quality in London is terrible. The government has introduced, rules whereby Sadiq has to get the air pollution down. A certain mayor of London called Boris Johnson introduced ULEZ.
He did.
It needed to be expanded. It needed to be expanded in order to make sure that air quality in London was better. And the difficulty is that there are changes that I think that do need to be made to that, and I'm sure we're asking Sadiq to have a look at that, and I'm sure that Sadiq would want to have a look at it too, because to be honest, unlike the Tories who seem to be saying, oh, we have these terrible defeats, but we're just going to carry on and carry on.
That's not
we're saying today, that we do need to reflect, and we do need to think about possibly changing things, which I haven't heard you say you're going to change anything.
I've
heard you saying that you're just going to carry on.
No, I mean, I'm very pleased that it sounds like you're doing a U-turn. I mean, I'm the MP for Sevenoaks. My constituents, my pensioners are not getting any scrappage scheme at all, measly as it is.
Have you got ULEZ in Sevenoaks?
No, pensioners we're right next door to London. So pensioners got the doctors at the end of the road who are driving down the road are going to be charged £12.50, who are crying to me in surgeries because they got to go to the hospital every week.
Doctor would be a long way from Sevenoaks to get to.
What? No, we're on the border of London, so it's Greater London.
I live near there.
Yeah.
You are a bit far out to go to the doctor there. That's
no. We're on the border of Greater London.
Well, I'm just going to interrupt because we're talking about this policy from Sadiq Khan. I think we can hear from the Mayor of London. Let's have a listen.
The decision to expand the ultra-low emission zone was a tough one, but it's the right one. Why? Because every year across our city, roughly speaking, 4,000 people die prematurely. There are children with stunted lungs forever, adults with a whole host of health issues from asthma to cancer, dementia to heart disease. So we do want to clean up the air in London. I think it's a human right, not a privilege. Nobody puts up with dirty water, why dirty air? But we're going to carry on listening. We're going to carry on monitoring the policy, monitoring take-up.
Should he scrap the expansion of the scheme?
No, I don't think he should, but I think he needs to change the way in which he's doing it.
Put a pause on it?
Well, that's something which needs to be open to discussion.
What do you think? Should he put a pause on it?
I think we should have ULEZ in London, but we need to introduce it in a way that works with people and listen to what people are saying. But we do need to have a ULEZ. We cannot carry on as it is. I can't have primary school children. Most of my primary school children are on main roads and their lungs are smaller than they should be. I mean, that's unacceptable.
I mean, looking at the electoral risks for Keir Starmer, this has been highlighted by this issue, hasn't it, in Uxbridge and South Ruislip?
Uxbridge was shaky for a couple of years and it was predicted to be lost by Boris Johnson. One of the reasons he stood down was that he didn't want to face a by-election because he thought he'd lose. In that situation, I think Labour and their candidate should have been out there some years ago, banging on doors and proving that they could do better. They rested on their laurels a bit. They thought it was coming their way. And it isn't that the Tories have won Uxbridge is that Labour just hadn't done anything to take it from them. The Tories didn't win it because they were better. They just won it because Labour let them.
Let me come to this because we haven't heard from her for a while.
I do think there is a much broader message in all of this, which is that we need to have urgent climate action, but it's got to be done in a way that is fair to ordinary folk. Now, when the Liberal Democrats first called for the windfall tax on the big oil and gas companies, we called for that tax because we said we could use some of the money to support people with their energy bills, but we could also use some of that money to actually decarbonise people's homes, make them warmer, reduce energy bills at the same time. That would have been fantastic climate action that would have helped people who were at the bottom of the ladder. And there are climate deniers out there who are now saying resisting climate action because they say it's too expensive.
So would you support Sadiq Khan's expansion of the ultra-low emission zone?
Liberal Democrats have said, well, at the time when the proposal was being... At the time the ULEZ was being proposed...
But you no longer...
No, hang on, no. When the idea was proposed, Liberal Democrats in the Greater London Authority said this is not a good way to do it. Caroline Pidgeon said at the time there needs to be a way of monitoring which cars are the most polluting and how far they travel to tackle precisely that point that you said your constituents are facing. We called for him to use the most up-to-date technology to monitor how far people would have to travel into the ULEZ zone, and we begged him to do that, and he didn't. I have also asked the Conservative government to put a scrappage scheme in place because some of my constituents in St Albans do also have to drive in or will have to drive into the expanded ULEZ zone for caring or for work. And the Conservative government has said no to supporting with a scrappage scheme. So actually, it's a bit of a plague on all of your houses.
All right, well, look,
may I say one last thing
on this? Otherwise, it's a whole programme on the ultra-low emissions zone.
No, but just on Uxbridge, it has never been Labour. I mean, it has never been Labour. So, yes, we were... But
Emily, you were expected to take it on a 7.5% swing.
It's never been Labour. So it still would have been absolutely historic if we had won it. Yes, the Tories were running out of road in relation to Uxbridge, but nevertheless, it had never been Labour. So it would. It was very close, and we certainly hope we're going to win it.
Henry, what about the idea of tactical voting? There's quite a lot of evidence to support the fact that that went on in spades in these by-elections last night, a real problem for the Conservatives.
It is a problem for the Conservatives because it means as well that if there are some areas, say in the Blue Wall in the south, where if you had a bad election on a sort of strict two-party swing, Labour might pick up some of those seats, but you might expect them to go back to the Tories. Whereas, irritatingly for the party, the Liberal Democrats, once they take something, they tend to be able to hold on to it for a very long time because they don't go into government and all the rest of it. So I think the Conservatives will be very worried if you're looking at those areas around London and the South East where tactical voting could not only put somebody over the line in a general election, but could set kind of like a tide line that would stick even if the Conservative Party's fortunes recovered.
Right, and that, of course, is in areas and in constituencies where a movement of support could be less than 10%. Obviously, in Somerton and Frome, it was far, far higher than that for the Liberal Democrats. The difference, of course, is in a general election, Daisy. The Liberal Democrats have proven themselves, again, to be a by-election winning machine. But that takes you to 15 seats, I think, in the current tally. When it comes to national elections, your support is still at 11%. It doesn't and it isn't reflected in national polls, is it?
Well, I campaigned in St Albans for 3.5 years before I was elected, and at that point my party was either at 8% or 24%, and it made absolutely no difference to the overall outcome. I think what you see in the national polls is either a pro-government or an anti-government vote, but in particular constituencies under this voting system, people often look to see who is the best choice for beating the Conservatives. Now, Liberal Democrats are the key challengers to the Conservatives in many seats around the country, and we'll be focusing our resources in those areas so we can play our part in hopefully removing this Conservative government.
I mean, Laura, 20 points ahead, Labour has been consistently. It hasn't changed since Rishi Sunak became leader and Prime Minister. Why not?
Well, I mean, they lost their deposit in Somerton and Frome, which I think is interesting. That you're not... that the electorate are not sold on Keir Starmer, right? Even this week, last weekend, he said he couldn't sign up to the inflation target.
But the answer to my question on the fact that Rishi Sunak said he would be a different kind of Prime Minister, that he would be able to transform the fortunes. He didn't use those words, but that was the implication with his pledges to be a different kind of government. There's just no evidence of it. The polls are still saying 20 points ahead, and Selby and Ainsty in North Yorkshire, not typical Labour territory, and you've been trounced.
I think we've had a really difficult year last year, and we've got a huge amount to do, right? But I think what is clear is the public isn't sold on Keir Starmer. And I think that's really important because we are setting out our stall. We're showing that we're making progress. We're showing we're making progress. We're showing we're making progress on the people's priorities, which are what we're trying to do as a government, which is getting down inflation. We saw that's some movement this week, not enough, but some in terms of growing the economy. We had the huge investment from Tata this week in the Gigafactory. That's a really big achievement for the government. We passed the illegal migration bill this week as well. We're showing real progress. And we think if we carry on doing that, if we show energy to try and change people's lives for the better, then we will win back people's trust and that will win back the vote.
You're going to carry on doing what you've been doing, which is put you 20 points behind.
Just
keep going. What a great idea.
Hang on, Emily.
In Somerton and Frome, the Conservatives put out a leaflet with a 6-point plan. It didn't mention the cost of living or the NHS once. Now, if that isn't a government that is out of touch, I do not know.
I'm sorry, Daisy, you
what is.
cannot say that we have not been talking constantly about inflation and making sure to get the rate of inflation down. We've been putting out the cost of living payments this year, which is giving £900 to people who most need it. This whole government is focused absolutely on helping people with the cost of living and getting that rate of inflation.
I've done so many of these by-elections, and and over the last since we've been in opposition, and I keep hearing, they keep getting trounced, and the Tories just keep coming into these studios and just going, we've just got to keep our nerve and just keep going because we're on the right course, and we just need a bit more time and everything's going to be fine. And frankly, that's fine by me. You don't want to listen to the public, you don't want to change, fine. We will remain 20 points ahead, and hopefully we will win the next general election.
What do you say, though, about the lack of enthusiasm for Keir Starmer? I mean, is a repeated refrain. We showed last night in the by-elections programme, all three leaders have negative personal poll ratings. Rishi Sunak's is the worst by quite some margin. But Keir Starmer still has negative poll ratings. Why?
I think that as people get to know Keir, they know that they have somebody who is steady, who is reliable, who is thoughtful, who has a clear idea of where he wants to go and where he wants to bring the country. He has changed the Labour Party. He can change the country too for the better. And, actually, I just think we've had kind of enough melodrama in our politics recently, and it would be nice to have a reliable party where you know where you're going and what the government is going to do and what our plan is.
The policy positions don't last a week. I mean, this guy will say anything to get elected, right? There has not been a... it is true. I mean, look, where are you on doctor strikes? This week, Rachel Reeves said that you'd sit around the table. Will you be discussing pay or not?
OK, so I'll tell you what's going on. We are putting forward a policy programme, and as we do, the economy collapses. Right? You guys have crashed the economy, and we are, and borrowing gets more expensive. The economy is falling apart in front of us, and so we have to adapt as we see. It is incredibly frustrating. Here we are sitting, on the margins in opposition, watching you guys making such a mess of the country, and you criticise us for having to tack our policies in order to catch up with the mess you're making of this country.
We've spent the money paying half of people's electricity bills over the winter. Do you think we shouldn't have done that?
I think you should have done it much faster, as we urge you to do much earlier.
Okay, first of all, then we would have had a bigger budget deficit. So then what would you have done then?
Because if you had introduced the windfall tax earlier
we've
and had done it in the right way...
very significant windfall tax, which has resulted in us being able to pay half of people's electricity bill over the winter.
All right.
That is a huge... We've made significant steps to help people with cost of living, and that has meant we're going to make some difficult decisions.
Let me just show you this headline in the HuffPost, because sitting in Laura's seat last night, Henry, was Johnny Mercer, the Veterans Minister. He says he slammed over in-betweeners jibe at new Labour MP. The Tory minister said voters want politicians who know what it's like to live, work and raise a family, because Keir Mather, the MP for Selby and Ainsty, is just 25. What did you make of what Johnny Mercer said?
I mean, we've had great politicians in this country who were much younger than 25. And I think, if anything, frankly, it's strange. If a generation ago, a 25-year-old would probably have had experience of work. They probably would have a family. And now, instead, we're at the point where I think a few months ago the government was considering whether or not to deprive people 25 and under of the right to carry a passenger in their car on their driving licence. So, no, I think it's perfectly fine for a 25-year-old. And if it is the case that 25-year-olds are less likely to own a home and have a family and all the rest of it than they used to, well, that's something that we need to change.
Is 25 too young?
No, it's not.
Right. Well, we've settled that.
They get to vote. So they should have people that can represent them in Parliament. But where Parliament lacks the right kind of diversity is they don't have enough disabled MPs. They don't have enough people who say, do you know what, I didn't have a family, but I'm still a human being and I have a right to be represented by government policies and that aren't just about working families. There are other types of people in the country.
And the amount of intergenerational injustice which is going on. You know, where our generation actually is doing really quite well out of the status quo. The younger generation are doing really badly. Of course, we need to have more young representatives. And, you know, this lad is great, you know, and it's going to be a great voice for his era. And, you know, when I was in the constituency, people thought that too. People in Selby said, yeah, let's give that Labour lad a chance. That's what they said to me.
Every MP, whoever they are, whichever party, will have to stand on their own track record. So, you know, good luck to him. And I really say good luck to him. And I think that he will bring fresh energy and enthusiasm. And if he can speak up for that generation of young people who, let's be honest, feel incredibly disenfranchised with what's going on in our country at the moment. They want urgent climate action. They want action on mental health. They want to have affordable housing. All of these things. Let's get more of that into Parliament. It'd be great.
Well, let's talk about something we haven't mentioned so far, or not directly, and that is Brexit. So, John Curtis, you're back with us. Boris Johnson triggered that by-election in his constituency after quitting as an MP back in June. He is, to some extent, the architect, if you like, of that slogan, Get Brexit Done. It was a key issue in 2019 and the Conservatives won that pretty impressive majority. What about now? Is it still a salient issue?
Well, it's still an issue that structures the vote, i.e. Leave voters are still more likely to vote Conservative than our Remain voters, and the opposite is true for Labour. But the link is not as strong as it was in 2019, when, of course, it was basically the defining issue of the 2019 general election. But it's a slightly different story for both for the three parties. In the case of the Conservatives, basically what has happened is that the Leave coalition that it brought together in 2019 has just fractured apart. Back in 2019, around 3/4 of people who'd voted Leave in 2016 voted Conservative. Now that figure is running at about 40%. In contrast, Conservative support amongst those people who voted Remain hasn't really changed very much. I think basically because if you voted Remain in 2016 and still believed in Remain in 2019, and you were then, however, willing to vote for Boris Johnson, you were basically a loyal Conservative voter, and these voters have continued to prove loyal. So that does therefore mean that actually, ironically, the Conservative Party vote now is much less pro-Leave than it was back in 2019. In the case of Labour, Labour has had some success in advancing more strongly amongst Leave voters than it has done amongst Remain voters. But that has to be put aside alongside the fact that, one, Labour is by far and away the most popular party amongst younger voters who've come of age since 2016, and they are virtually all pro-Remain. And two, that those people who have switched from Conservative to Labour are also more likely to have switched from Leave to now rejoin since 2016. And as a result, therefore, actually, the composition of Labour's vote in terms of where people stand on Brexit isn't that different from what it was in 2019. We're still looking at around 3/4 of the Labour vote coming from people who would want to rejoin the European Union, and only a quarter coming from those who want to stay out. And that Labour clearly don't want to talk about the issue this side of election, but they will need to be aware that they're being elected. At the moment, at least, if they are elected, it will be by an overwhelmingly pro-rejoin EU election. The Democrats, very briefly, they've certainly lost a lot of ground amongst those people who are in favour of rejoining the European Union, because they also have stopped talking about it. But it's unlike Labour, it is not clear that, at least at the level of individual voters, they have compensated for the loss of ground amongst Remain voters by gaining ground amongst Leave voters.
So John Curtis, thank you very much. Laura, would you agree that Rishi Sunak hasn't made the most of opportunities of Brexit?
I don't think it's possible to say that in a week in which we signed the CPTPP, which is a huge trade deal, right? Well, would you not sign? I mean, I think it was
a choice between a deal with the European Union, who are our closest neighbours, and with the Pacific. I think that there's a lot of sense.
So you would redo a deal with the European Union?
No. You're asking me what I think. I think the CPTPP is not the answer to leaving the European Union. Of course it isn't.
So, but you just compare the two. So you would rejoin the European Union?
No.
You put that as a choice.
No. we would not rejoin the European Union, but we would not be fooling the public into believing the CPTPP is the answer. The answer is to have a closer working relationship with the European Union. And a closer relationship with the European Union means talking to them, which means things like having a deal on you know what, our food standards are the same as the European food standards. We don't need to have all this stupid red tape when we try to export cheese to the European Union. We don't need that. We could have an agreement, for example, on that, and you guys won't even talk about it.
Did you disagree with the Windsor framework?
Listen, you're the one who said the CPTPP is suddenly the answer to all our woes. It is
let's
definitely isn't.
Let's try not to talk about acronyms too much.
It'll be less than a 1% growth in our economy.
Well, let's probe on that point.
Time.
I mean, Laura, can you say hand on heart that new trade deal that's been signed in the Pacific with the Pacific is anything like comparable to a trade deal with the EU?
This is one of many trade deals that we're doing, but the point about it is with a really high growth, exciting area, right, where we have the opportunity to make a huge deal of this, right? That it's something which presents enormous opportunity and I think is emblematic of the sort of thing we can do outside of the European Union.
I mean, let's have a look at this headline. Emily, in The Times, Labour could tear up Brussels' deal to forge closer economic links with Europe. That's David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, your colleague. Are you going to renegotiate that deal with Europe?
Within the deal that Boris Johnson signed on Christmas Eve, you may remember, that had all kinds of holes in it. But one of the things it had was that any government, whether it was Conservative or Labour, was going to have to look again at the deal, and I can't remember when it is, but it would be after the next general election. So if we were to be given the great honour of looking after this country in government, we would need to go back to the European Union anyway and look again at the deal and renegotiate. That's what any government would need to do, and we think there are lots of things that we can do. Veterinary agreement being at the top of the list.
Right, but you are going to broadly renegotiate something I presume you would be in huge support of, Daisy. You'd be backing Labour's line on this.
Well, we're the only party, the Liberal Democrats, to set out a four-stage plan to build a closer relationship with the EU.
Right.
That starts with rejoining a number of different individual EU programmes to do with science or the Erasmus scheme, which would be good for young people who...
To eventually rejoin the single market.
Our next stage would be to renegotiate the current deal because, you know, there are small organisations, small businesses in my constituency that are absolutely wrapped up in red tape.
Would you like to rejoin the EU?
So our fourth-stage plan talks about rejoining the single market as a fourth stage at some point in the future. But there are things that could be done right now, including renegotiating this deal to get a better deal for small businesses and for farmers who have been completely cut loose by this government.
Right. I mean, how big is Brexit an issue, do you think, for Conservative Home readers?
Well, it's part of the general sense of disillusion, which I think an awful lot of grassroots Conservatives feel about the government. It's not just Brexit. There's a general sense that after 13 years in office, which is as long as New Labour ever got, they haven't changed the country very much. But a big part of that is, I suppose, the sense that they haven't managed to make as much of Brexit as they might, that the process of leaving was very badly handled. You've obviously got the ongoing problems with Northern Ireland and the kind of unravelling of the government's stories about the Windsor framework. So that's definitely a factor, but it's not the only thing that's dispiriting Tory activists at the moment.
Right. I mean, it's interesting that people, I think some people think that Rishi Sunak is a Remainer, or more Remain, certainly, than Boris Johnson, and yet he was always a supporter of Brexit.
Oh, yeah, no, this is very one of the sort of Alice in Wonderland elements of the recent row, is that Boris Johnson's supporters very often style themselves as the Conservative right, and, you know, Rishi Sunak is. And then you actually look and, you know, Boris Johnson is pro-sugar tax, liberalised immigration, raised taxes, didn't really do anything terribly right-wing on an awful lot of fronts compared to Rishi Sunak, who is a much more consistent centre-right, right-wing candidate on economic policy and so on. So, no, it's very strange, but that's just one of the sort of topsy-turvy things that's come out of the last year.
How should Keir Starmer handle Brexit now?
Look, I think most of the country is, despite Laura and Emily's ability to have another argument about it, most of the country is fed up of the word and doesn't want to hear it mentioned ever again. I think most people accept that it has happened. It seems to be where it is. If there is a sunset clause in the deal and it has to be renegotiated, please do so, but don't talk to anybody about it while you're doing it. And obviously, most of the country would say, look, there's a load of things that just cocked up in that and needs sorting out. But I think, generally speaking, most people are upset with it. But that Rishi's fundamental problem is that he was supposed to be the safe pair of hands after 2 extremely chaotic catastro premierships that was supposed to steady the boat, get as many people as possible in the lifeboats and ensure that when you went into the next general election, the Tory party wouldn't be wiped out for a generation and be back in power in maybe 5 years' time. And what's happened, and I think he probably doesn't understand why this is, but despite the fact he is not as chaotic and works much harder than the previous 2 prime ministers, is that he's still 20 points behind. It makes no difference. And he is not doing the really simple, easy things that it would take perhaps to persuade people to give him another chance.
All right, well, let's catch up and take a look again at the state of British politics following these by-elections with the BBC's chief political correspondent, Nick Eardley. What happens now, Nick, apart from the fact that MPs go on their summer break and summer recess? Because there had been some talk of a reshuffle by Rishi Sunak, perhaps dependent on the results, and also a reshuffle of the shadow cabinet by Keir Starmer.
I think the government reshuffle is probably on hold until September now, Joe. A shadow cabinet reshuffle could come a bit sooner. There's still a lot of speculation that could come next week, although nobody in the Labour Party is really engaging with it in any significant way. But look, in terms of what comes next, I suspect for the Conservatives, there's going to be a lot of soul searching about what Susie was just talking about. What on earth you do next to try and turn things around? There will be a debate, I'm sure, as there always is, about whether the party needs to talk about cutting tax, something the Treasury is really reluctant to do at the moment. And there'll be an interesting debate, I think, too, in the Labour Party about ULEZ. I know you talked about it earlier in the programme, but it is proving a bit of a headache for the Labour Party. Sadiq Khan is not budging on it, but the Labour leadership sounds very, very cold on ULEZ this morning.
Right, and in terms of the choreography, when Parliament comes back in the autumn, always a sort of reset moment, if you like, and also possibly some more by-elections.
Yeah, probably 3 more by-elections coming, all of which could be Labour gains, potentially, if they play their cards right. We'll have to see how that plays out. Remember, there's Nadine Dorries' seat, which she's promised to resign. There's Chris Pincher's seat, he could face recall, and likewise Margaret Ferrier, the SNP MP up in Scotland. So all of those are potentials for Labour to show that they're consolidating support. But I mean, in terms of when Parliament comes back, the really interesting thing, I was with Rishi Sunak this morning in South Ruislip, I don't think he's going to change much at all. His message was we need to keep delivering on the things we've promised. He's still talking about his 5 pledges. They've become the cornerstone of what he is pledging to do in government. So I wouldn't expect coming back in September to see a radical new direction for Rishi Sunak as he tries to climb the mountain he has to climb. His view seems to be that his best, perhaps his only chance, is making those 5 pledges on the economy, the NHS, and there's one other, on small boats, making them all happen. They're proving quite difficult, though.
Yeah, it's always difficult to remember all of them, isn't it, in one go? Nick Eardley, our chief political correspondent, thank you very much. Henry Hill, in terms of the Conservatives, do you think there won't be any significant change, and do you think the right of the Conservative Party are going to start to ruffle feathers?
Well, the right might, but with Boris Johnson out of the House of Commons, they don't really have a vector for destabilising Rishi's government. And I wonder if Boris is going to be haunted by the fact that they actually held Uxbridge, because there was a version, sort of my nightmare scenario, where he turned it into a referendum on ULEZ. Everyone was shouting about Partygate, and he just talked about ULEZ and won, and completely transformed the narrative. But what Rishi needs to do, and he has acknowledged this, I think, and he's said that he's going to do it, but I don't know if he will, is you need a grand narrative. He's just doing this very kind of vote Labour and win a microwave, is what was said about the 2015 Labour campaign. You've got these bitty promises which he may or may not hit, but he's not given people a kind of big picture vision of what his Britain would look like. He needs to do that.
And for Keir Starmer?
I think what Uxbridge has shown, and to some extent as well what Rishi's doing, is showing that complacency and poor communications really can lose you the elections. They're not communicating properly about ULEZ, they didn't communicate properly between the mayoralty and the government, and they're not communicating properly, as far as Rishi's concerned, with what he's actually about and what kind of... If he is supposed to be integrity, professionalism and accountability, he needs to sit down and meet nuclear test veterans, as he's promised to discuss the fact that the state irradiated them.
Yes.
He needs to do lots of other things that are fairly simple, simple, easy vote winners that show he's a decent guy.
That's it from us, from Politics Live for the summer. Thank you to all of our guests for joining me today. As Parliament is now going into recess, we will be back on Monday, the 4th of September at 12:15. Write it in your diaries now. Here, back on BBC Two in the iPlayer. From all of us, though, have a great summer.